Thank you, Moses. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone else who's here in attendance. I appreciate your presence. And I'd also like to thank the other members of other faculty who are affiliated with the Trans-Institutional Program, Africa at a Crossroads, for inviting me here as well. So my talk today for all of you is, in fact, based on my book, Gesture and Power, which came out last year, published by Duke University Press. And so what I'll do is basically go through the main ideas in the book and highlight a couple examples to give you an idea of what I'm trying to do there. And then at the end, I hope we could have a good conversation about the role of gesture and studies of embodiment and what they can teach us for all types of different research. So I'll start by saying the book, as I said, came out last year in 2016 with Duke University Press. Recently found out it won the Elliott P. Skinner Award by the Association for Africanist Anthropology for 2017. It was also a finalist for the Clifford Geertz Award by the Society for the Anthropology of Religion as well. So if you're interested, please check it out. So what I wanted to start with is actually two quotes that help us to start thinking through ideas of the body. And the first one is from Marcel Mauss, who was a French sociologist who wrote in the 1930s, "The body is man's first and most natural instrument." Now, everyone in this room is a different person. We're all wearing different clothes. We have different preferences, different foods that we like. But one thing that we do all have in common is we all have a physical body, however differently abled they are. But what, in fact, can you do with your body? What can we accomplish with these bodies? So what I'm interested in is how people can use their bodies to affect change in the world. And actually, this is an interesting moment to consider this in terms of our larger national discourse on people using their bodies, NFL players using their bodies to protest police violence, for example. But there are a number of other examples we could even think about as well. But my book focuses on a particular group of people and how they're using their bodies in particular ways. And so to capture this, I'm going to use another quote. This is a quote in Kikongo. Insisa wangoma wusobele, soba makina maku. When the rhythm of the ngoma, which is a drum, changes, change your dance. And this is basically a saying that was explained to me during my field research in the Democratic Republic of Congo that's used to remind people that they have to adapt to larger changes. Things that used to work for you may not continue to work in the future. So how is it that you adjust to these new situations? So while this quote is about everyday adaptation, I believe at a larger level, it also poignantly captures the many personal and social transformations that Africans endured as they faced their own challenges in regards to the transatlantic trade, in regards to the spread of European colonization, and also the specific challenges with post-colonial countries as well. So this book is about how people of the Congo ethnic group, and that's Congo with a K, also known as BC Congo, this is a term that they used when I was doing my research, and also known as Ba Congo, which is a term that many researchers use to describe this group, in the Democratic Republic of Congo have used and continue to use their physical bodies to fight for social and political change. So just to give you a sense of where I'm talking about, this is the DRC, at the heart of the African continent. And I conducted my research over here in the Lower Congo province, which has now been renamed Congo Central. And here's another representation of it, of Bakongo, which is now Congo Central since 2015. And I actually did my research in two places, in Kinshasa, which is the biggest city in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a small town of about 13,000 people known as Luozi. And this is a small town that's on the opposite side of the Congo River. So it's still in the Lower Congo province, but you have to cross the Congo River to get there. So the BC Congo are the ethnic group that you find in this Lower Congo province that's closest to the Atlantic Ocean. And you also find them in Angola, which is to the south, and in the Republic of Congo, which is to the north as well. And between those three countries, there are about 6 million people who speak Kikongo as one of their first languages. But how much social change can people achieve with their physical bodies? So in my book, I argue that what I call everyday cultural performances and interpersonal encounters, which are face-to-face interactions with people, are crucial sites for making political claims used to legitimize and inspire larger social movements. So more specifically, I'm interested in how the body is used to support religious claims to authority that can either challenge or support existing structures of power. And using the BC Congo ethnic group as a case study, I show that performances in daily life at the micro level can have a decisive effect on macro level structures in politics, and can also be impacted by those same social structures. And so in order to demonstrate this, I wanted to start by just reading for you the first few pages of Gesture and Power to give you a sense of what I'm looking at in terms of these gestures. What do I mean, and what is it that's happening here? May 11th, 1921, Leon George Morel, the territorial administrator for the Southern Cataracts Territory in the Lower Congo of Colonial Belgian Congo, is heading to the town of Nkamba. And Nkamba is over here. He is investigating the activities of Simon Kimbangu, a man who local Congo people are calling a prophet. Many people are flocking to Nkamba, leaving jobs, carrying sick relatives for healing, and rapidly increasing the anxiety of Belgian colonial administrators. Morel arrives at Nkamba in the company of 2 soldiers, estimating the crowd at around 800 people. As he continues on the road into town, he encounters Kimbangu, who was accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. Kimbangu is wearing red pants and a white flannel shirt and is carrying a stick shaped like a bishop's staff. Morel observes his behavior. The person of interest, he writes, was agitated by a general trembling of his body. His companions, Morel notes, were all agitated by the same trembling and making bizarre shouts. They make a circle around him, and Morel tries to speak to the group, but they do not respond. After the trembling subsides, Morel sets up his tent in the town. Simon Kimbangu approaches the tent, and after reading the story of David and Goliath from the Bible, comes forward to shake Morel's hand. I notice that his hand is icy, Morel writes, a reaction following the period of nervous shaking. I take advantage of this period of calm to ask Kimbangu the reason for this not very suitable and grotesque manner of receiving me. He responds that it is God that ordered him to meet me in this way, and that the bizarre shouts are nothing but his conversation with God. It is God that orders him and his apostles to tremble in this way. During Morel's visit to Nkamba, Kimbangu, his disciples, and the assembled crowd largely ignore and openly challenge Morel's orders, his probing questions, and his authority as a representative of the colonial administration. Consequently, Morel advised his superiors in the colonial government for urgent and immediate action to suppress the movement because, quote, the natives will say they have found the God of the blacks. It is certain that he, Kimbangu, could direct the spirit of the natives toward hostility to the white race, end quote. October 1st, 2005. I'm staying in the town of Luozi in the westernmost province of Bakongo. The town is the administrative center of Luozi Territory, which is a largely rural area covered with green rolling hills, mountains, and wide plots of cassava, soybeans, and other agricultural crops. I'm walking down the red dirt road next to the soccer field that doubles as an airplane landing strip, an area that locals jokingly refer to as Luozi's airport. My friend Tano and I were invited to attend an event organized by Valdivia Congo, a nationalist movement seeking to address the political and economic marginalization of Congo people by combining religion, politics, and cultural revitalization. The larger goal of Valdivia Congo, also known as BDK, that was the acronym that they used, was to gain autonomy by restoring the pre-colonial Congo kingdom in the present day. Their members were becoming increasingly active in Luozi and other parts of the Lower Congo, as well as in Kinshasa. Because of their emphatic rejection of Christianity as the white man's religion, and advocating their own religion called Bu-Congo instead, BDK members were often in conflict with local churches. This particular event was to honor members of the group killed in 2004 in a confrontation with both local law enforcement and members of the major missionary-founded Protestant church in Luozi, which is the most powerful church in the area. Tano and I meet a small group of BDK members on the road to the cemetery, where they are singing and waving small green branches. As we join the group, one of the local leaders tells me a young white missionary wanted to see the ceremony, and they denied her access. Looking at me fiercely, he says, "We can't reveal all our secrets, but you are our sister, so you can come." After the ceremony ends, I am introduced to another man representing the regional leadership of the group. I reach out my hand for a handshake and greeting. and he just looks down at it, unmoving. I stand there with my hand outstretched, completely embarrassed, until Tano quickly reminds me to use the Bula Makonko gesture, where the hands are cupped and clapped together 3 times. Looks like this. I clap my cup hands. Finally, the man, who I will call Netatu, physically responds in kind, saying, "This is the proper form of greeting in Congo culture, dating back to the Congo Kingdom. That is why in Valdivia Congo, we greet each other in this way. Congo people need to let go of the white man's ways and honor their own culture. That is how things will change for us." While separated by more than 80 years, both of these incidents illustrate the importance of micro-interactions of the body in framing and staking political claims. Nationalist movements for people of the Congo ethnic group have often taken religious forms over the past century. Different ways of using the body in social interaction play a large role in these movements. In the case of Kimbangu, the spirit-induced trembling he experienced, caused by the Holy Spirit, started a region-wide Christian prophetic movement that threatened the hegemony of Western missionaries and Belgian colonial administrators alike. This messianic movement, inspired by prophecies of independence and a reversal of the world order. So for example, prophecies that the entire Atlantic Ocean would dry up and Europeans would have to leave the Congo by walking home in the dry ocean bed. Prophecies that ancestors who had passed along and passed away would come back. And so people actually cleaned the paths to cemeteries and removed all the weeds from around the headstones so that they could arrive in a setting that was clean and clear. Prophecies that basically everything would be turned on its ear, that Jesus would come back, all kinds of different things in this millennial movement. And this movement blended Congo traditional embodied forms and ritual with mission-inspired Protestant Christianity, including hymns, social conduct, and biblical interpretation. Looking at the colonial suppression of the movement through arrests, interrogations, violence, and imprisonment in penal labor camps. In fact, that was the main way that the Belgians decided to deal with the movement. It was actually by, if you were caught trembling, literally, if you were caught trembling, you were arrested. And if they thought you were affiliated with this prophetic movement, you'd be arrested and sent to a penal labor camp on the other side of the Belgian Congo, way on the other side. And again, this is a huge country. And so Simon Kimbangu was arrested in 1921. He was tried, found guilty, and he actually died in a labor camp 30 years later in 1951. He was never released. And so there were a number of people who had similar fates, but then there were also some people who came back afterwards. And so this is how the Belgians chose to deal with this movement. And they clearly believed that their authority in both religious and political matters was being threatened. Likewise, my own embodied interactions with Valdivia Congo reveal the importance of gesture for fostering ethnic nationalist sentiment and taking on an active role in everyday struggles for power and authority. So what I wanted to point out about this is actually a picture I took with my video camera. And this was at a huge meeting that Valdivia Congo had, an assembly. And the head of their movement, his name is, and this movement actually still exists, his name is Nemwanda Nsemi. And Nemwanda Nsemi was running for their equivalent of the Congress at the time. And so they had this huge meeting in Luozi, and he did not come to Luozi. He was actually running to represent Luozi territory, but was scared to come and cross the Congo River because according to his followers, local law enforcement had said if he came over there, he would not leave, that basically he would die. And so he never set foot in Luozi territory, but he won. He actually won and went to Congress to represent the territory, and that was in 2006. And then in 2011, he ran again, and this time he ended up winning again and representing a district in Kinshasa. So this is a way that this movement that's really a religious nationalist movement has turned itself into a political powerhouse in some kinds of ways in terms of actually gaining access to political representation. And there's more to say about him if anyone wants to know, because there's some recent events also that have happened. But the point I'm trying to make here is that they're trying to foster this feeling of recreating the Congo Kingdom in the present. So if you encountered anyone from Valdivia Congo in the street and you reached out your hand to shake your hand, they would not respond. They would expect for you to do Bula Makonko. And if you didn't, and that's the name of the gesture, and if you didn't, then you would be verbally chastised. You'd be harassed if you didn't do this. So it was a way of really trying to shape people's everyday habits in a particular way. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I was as an African American woman in particular really became implicated in these religious and nationalist politics in the Congo at the time as well. So gestures and spirit-induced trembling are two of several important types of everyday cultural performances that are sites of struggles for power in daily life. But how can the physical body do so much? What is the relationship between everyday embodied cultural performances and power? So in the book, I basically blend history and ethnography to explore how everyday cultural performances of the body, such as gestures, which is bimpampa in Kikongo, dances, makinu, and spirit-induced trembling, zakama, are used to create, confirm, and contest authority in daily life. And what I do is I build upon previous studies of performance in Africa. But what I do that's different is instead of thinking of performance as something that's only on a stage, like when you think of performance, you think of someone performing on a stage for the most part. I look at performances in everyday life and how people are using these everyday performances in interactions with others, in fact, to fight against and resist the status quo. I also take a chronological approach to show the importance of daily performances in shaping the social and political lives of the BC Congo people and the connections between these performances and larger social change. So my focus is on everyday performances from the early 20th century to 2010 to really illuminate the agency of Congo people themselves in engaging with and redefining themselves in relation to Christianity, post-colonial dictatorships, and present-day social and political marginalization. And in analyzing these periods of social change, I'm not trying to write an exhaustive history, but rather I look at significant performative encounters, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, that best illustrate how these everyday cultural performances are affected by and have an impact on larger social transformations. So the book itself is separated into 4 parts. In the first part, I explain my influences in terms of theory, in terms of performance, and in terms of power, and also religion. And I also talk about what it means to be implicated in your research site, how people came to understand me as an African American woman, and how I then was understood in a particular way because of the context of Valdivia Congo and other kinds of things happening at the time. And I'll explain that in a second. And then in the second part of the book, I focus specifically on Simon Kimbangu's movement, which started in 1921 and continued all the way up until independence. It never stopped. So although the Belgians kept on arresting people, beating people, sending them to these penal labor camps, the movement continued unabated. They in fact called them terrorists. They called them terrorist cells whenever these religious movements would spring up, starting from Kimbangu on. But they continued all the way through from 1921 up until 1960, when independence was earned. And then the third part of the book, I look at a different kind of situation, dances, and how they were used during the era of Mobutu Sese Seko. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Mobutu. But during the time that he was president of the Congo, he renamed the country as Zaire. And as a part of this kind of nationalist project that he came up with, in which the country's name changed, he wanted people to get rid of their European names and embrace African names, wear African-inspired clothing, and so on and so forth. He also had a policy of forced dancing and singing. So initially, when it started, people were volunteering to sing his praises when he first came to power through a coup. But later on, it became a part of a nationalist project in which people were actually forced to dance and sing. This was called l'animation politique, political animation. And so I look at this in 2 chapters in part 3 of my book to look at how he was trying to use performance in people's bodies to in fact affect their minds and get them to accept a number of different ideas, including himself as the most powerful, as even having spiritual powers, all kinds of things that they would put into the songs to sing his praises. And in the last part of the book, I look at Valdivia Congo and their use of embodiment to change their larger world, again by trying to recreate this Congo kingdom in the present, and in a number of different ways. So this Bulamakanko as a greeting, but it's also their prayer. They actually use this as their form of prayer in their worship practices. So what I wanted to do was to basically talk about a few ideas that animate the work. The first is this idea of performance, which you see in both the title and also throughout most of the talk. So what do I mean by performance? So I combine several approaches to define performance as restored behavior, enacted with heightened awareness or consciousness, with the capacity to transform social realities. And I'll look at each part of this in a second. So restored behavior is the idea that what we do with our bodies is never for the first time. Someone has already done it before. So I'll give you the example of zakama, this spirit-induced trembling that I talk about in the book. So when Simon Kimbangu started to do this as a part of his religious movements, in fact, a number of Western missionaries said, well, that is just what the Banganga used to do. And Banganga are the traditional healers and ritual specialists in the area. And so they said that what he was doing was heathen and not Christian. But in fact, he said, no, this is the Holy Spirit that's animating me. And so this is in fact a Christian, form of Christian embodiment. He redefined it as Christian embodiment. So that form of embodied trembling, which in fact Banganga used to do when they were possessed by a territorial spirit, people call that now Mayembo, meaning that it's a territorial spirit that's causing the trembling. But if it's the Holy Spirit, then it's called zakama. So it's a different names depending on who's actually or what's causing the trembling. Next, heightened awareness. This is a huge important part of what is performance. So you can think, for example, about walking down a hallway, an empty hallway. No one else is there. You walk down the hallway. You don't think anything about what you're doing. It's just an action, right? It's just accomplishing something. But you're just getting from one place A to point B. But if you're a young lady and you're walking down that same hallway and it's now lined with football players, you'll start to think about your actions very differently. You'll be very aware of every step that you take because you know that you're being watched. So what I mean by performance is when you're doing something and you become aware of this audience that is in fact taking in that performance, that's what makes it a performance. That's what makes the difference between action, between doing and performing. So once you become aware, this heightened sense of consciousness or awareness, that is what makes something into a performance. So whether that audience is another person, whether that audience is a spiritual entity, or whether that audience is yourself, this is what helps to turn action into performance. And lastly, the capacity to transform social reality. So this, I am drawing upon the work. It's basically making the point that performances are transformative, they're not just reflective. So performances don't just reflect society, but can also be used to change society. And again, I'll go back to that idea of Valdivia Congo and how they were able to use embodiment in a number of different contexts to mobilize people to help with the elections in 2006 and 2011 as well. The second concept I want to explain is performative encounters. So this is the term that I came up with to try and understand what was happening in these interactions. So what I did was I took this idea of performative utterances, which comes from a man named J.L. Austin, who was a linguist, who basically said there's a difference between declarative statements, like the car is red, versus performative statements. So for example, when a pastor or priest is marrying a couple, and they say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or husband and husband, or wife and wife, whatever way they want to have it, once that pronunciation is made, to whoever is viewing, to the public, you're considered married, right? So this saying actually accomplishes an action. And then I can give you another example that he uses in his own book, a boat. When you Christian a boat, and you break a bottle of wine on the side, I christened this boat the Mary. From that point forward, the boat is known as the Mary. So your words are actually accomplishing an action. So saying something is doing something. And what I am looking at is when doing something does something more. So this is what makes these encounters performative, because they're changing the social relationship in some way that didn't exist before. And in terms of encounters, I'm drawing on the work of Erving Goffman, who's a sociologist who wrote quite a bit about performances in everyday life, but also about the encounter between two people as the place in which focused interaction occurs. What's different is that with Erving Goffman's work, he basically said that most encounters support and reinforce the status quo. But for my own work, performative encounters undo that. They undo the status quo. When you have a handshake that's rejected, when you have a greeting that's negotiated, when you're expected to clap when a motorcade passes by, which is what used to happen during Mobutu Sese Seko's time. So the ways in which the status quo is changed in ways that people didn't expect or perhaps didn't anticipate, and start to challenge it in both ways. The other thing I wanted to explain a bit quickly is to talk about the different kinds of everyday cultural performances I'm looking at. The first is bimpampa, which are gestures. And there's not one word that actually means gesture. It was really hard to find something that worked, but people gave me a number of different words to work with. And this was one that came up a couple times, so I just settled on it. But it could very well be bisinsu, or another Kikongo term that tried to capture some of this. But these gestures, when I'm focusing on these different types of performances, I'm not just picking them out of the air, that they're actually performances that have historical and cultural salience for this particular ethnic group. So these gestures, for example, if you remember when I read the story from the beginning of the book, the regional leader of Valdivia Congo said, well, this is something they used to do in the Congo Kingdom. And in fact, if you go back and look at some of the documents from the Congo Kingdom in the 1600s, there were these missionaries, mainly Italian missionaries, who were sent to the Congo Kingdom to evangelize. And in fact, the Congo Kingdom, which covered, the capital was in modern-day Angola, in Mbanza, Congo, and went up to what's in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some people say into Republic of Congo, depending on the time period. So along the place where you basically find people who speak Kikongo, there was this massive, this very, very powerful kingdom, and which we believe started about the 1200s and went into the 1800s. But this, in this kingdom, in fact, if you go back and look at the reports that these missionaries would send back to Rome, you could find it everywhere. Now, when I first started doing this research, I wasn't really looking at these types of gestures. I didn't really know much about it, but it was only through having gone to the Congo and having these gestures become a part of my own body that I became very aware of them. So when I came back, I was actually still doing bula makonko, just in greeting to people in dekama, which is genuflection. And I had to stop myself, like, what am I doing? They don't understand what I'm doing. But when it became a part of my body, then I said, you know what? If it's a part of my body, I'm just basically a visitor in a sense. I'm not even living necessarily long term in the society over my whole life. What does it mean for someone who's a part of this society? And so when I went back and looked at the historical records and saw in the reports, once you knew what to look for, it was everywhere. Bula makonko, this cup hand clapping, they used it to open and close meetings. They used it for ritual process. They used it for greetings on the road. They used it in all kinds of spaces. And these are from reports from the 1600s, one after the other. These missionaries commenting on this cup hand clapping, used to ask for forgiveness from the Congo king, used when the Congo king was actually passing on, giving someone like a dukeship or some kind of larger authority in over a piece of land, that it was used for all of these processes. And so then I came to understand that this was a gesture that had a very, very long history in terms of how it was used in so many different settings. And so it's just one among many that you could discuss, but this is one that I focus on. And I also add that there's work of other scholars. There's an art historian named Barbara Martinez Ruiz, who wrote a book on Congo body language and graphic writing. And he points to physical evidence from cave paintings in which he asserts that the gestural history of this region goes back several thousand years, that these cave paintings that he found, not that he found, but that he has looked at the research on, in fact show that gestures among the Bakongo, he writes, are a form of language and a mode of communication in their own right. So it's not just something that accentuates language, but it actually is, in fact, its own form of language. It's accomplishing something. And then the other thing that I do talk about are dances, makinu. And I don't talk about them as much today, but I look at how dances have been politicized in many different types of ways. So during that same prophetic movement that I mentioned in the 1920s, as I said, it kept on, the Belgians couldn't get a good handle on it. It kept on exploding in different parts of the lower Congo. They would try and arrest all of these people. Next thing you know, it popped up somewhere a couple miles away, and so it just continued. And there was one colonial administrator who came up with this idea. He was actually the colonial territorial administrator for Luozi. And he said, you know what, why don't we force people to dance? Because the prophets who were associated with this prophetic movement said that people who followed them should not engage in secular dances. They should not dance. They should only dance basically for God, right? But not in secular kinds of contexts. So they shouldn't dance with, at these events where they had the ngoma. In fact, they should break their ngoma, their drums. And so this territorial administrator came up with the idea of forcing people to dance at a particular time each day. He, in fact, requested money from the colonial administration to make this happen as a way of combating this movement. And from there, the record kind of fell silent. I'm not sure how it turned out, whether he actually was able to do it. But it's just to raise the point that dances themselves were politicized in many types of ways. And so in my chapters that deal specifically with Makino, I look at a number of different ways that they're politicized. And then the spirit-induced trembling, the zakama. This is really the form of embodiment that I spent a lot of time looking at, especially because it was so important in Simon Kimbangu's movement, for example. And so I look at that and how it has changed and how people used it in order to find a different access to a different form of authority than what they were closed off from through the Western missionaries who were stationed there and also the Belgian colonial authorities as well. Some of the main points of the book. I have 3 main points that I'm trying to make in terms of my own theoretical contributions. So besides the performative encounters as an idea, I try to think about the importance of body in the process of doing research as well. So the first thing I talk about is the body as center. The body as center. And so this is about looking at and privileging the body as a method of inquiry, not as something that's tangential or marginalized or something that is not as important as other things, but something that you in fact start with. If you understand and can accept that in fact people are using their bodies to get things done, then why wouldn't you look at that? And then as a part of that, I look at also the body of the researcher in their research site. As I mentioned, as an African-American woman, I had a very different experience than someone who would have been read as European or white in this particular site. And this was, again, a part of the moment at the time, but also a part of larger histories as well. So, for example, I went back to the Congo in 2010. I did most of this research in 2005 and 2006. I went back in 2010. And I went to the American Cultural Center, which is a building that's associated with the American Embassy. It's not the American Embassy, it's a few blocks down. Now, I went to the Congo originally as a Fulbrighter. So I used to go to the American Cultural Center to use the internet, access the library, do a number of other things. And so I wanted to go and say hello to some people, see how people were doing. And also I was going to give a lecture there at the end of the month. And so I said, well, let me just go and check in and make sure everything's going well. So I go and approach the Cultural Center, and I'm stopped immediately in my tracks. And I'm told, hey, get to the side over there with the rest of the Congolese. And so I turn and look and see a long line of Congolese men and women in the hot sun, waiting patiently to get into the American Cultural Center. And so I moved to the side because I didn't want to cause any trouble. Again, this is an embassy-affiliated building. So there are soldiers there, you know, with guns and all. So I said, okay. I stepped to the side to pull out my passport. As I'm standing there, other people who are American are approaching the door. Other people who are white Americans. And so they did not stop them at all. They were allowed to approach the door with no problem. I had to pull out my passport to prove I was actually American before they would even let me approach the door. And this is just one example of many kinds of situations I had in post-colonial Congo, which I hadn't really anticipated. Things like going to the store and them asking me to leave my bag at the side. Whereas women who were seen as phenotypically white would not be asked the same question. Things like approaching buildings that were associated with the embassy or any other kinds of spaces where Americans or other people with some means were living and being told, no, you can't come in. We don't know who you are. You don't have a car. I didn't have a car. So I didn't look like the typical American in Kinshasa. They usually had like a big SUV and a driver. And I was on foot and taking taxis. And so they were like, no, you can't come in. I had that happen to me so many different times. I've been read as a prostitute. I've had people approach me. Anyways, if you read the book, you'll see some of the stories in there. But it's about understanding what it means. Because literally how I looked, because people read me as either Congolese or some other African, whether Ivorian or Nigerian or South African, they rarely ever guessed I was American. Even if I spoke English, and I tried. You know, I'd say, well, I'm American, you know, I'm American. They're like, you're not American. Stop playing, you know, no, you're not American. I had a number of different incidents where I had to deal with that. People thought I was Jamaican, because at the time I had dreadlocks. So a number of different things, but usually it was some kind of African. And so I got treated accordingly. And so it helped me to understand what is the daily experience like for Congolese people, but especially Congolese women. And so this also implicated me in the site in other kinds of ways, because one of the other prophecies that Simon Kimbangu gave, supposedly in 1921, and this is in a number of different archival documents, was a prophecy that African Americans in particular were going to come back to the Congo and help the Congolese to fight the Belgians. So I found this in a number of different documents. No one who was able to say, not like they interviewed Simon Kimbangu and he said it himself, but all of these different people who said, well, I was there when he said this, and I heard that he said this. So a number of different documents where they point to this prophecy. And so at the time that I was there, as I mentioned, Valdivia Congo was very popular. And a part of their own need to connect themselves to Kimbangu's prophecy, which they draw on as part of their own politics, they said, you know what, we told you these African Americans will be coming. You know, this is why you should join our movement. Simon Kimbangu's prophecy is coming true. We already told you this was going to happen. They, in fact, had a pamphlet for African Americans who would come back that they would tell you how you have to live in this new Congo that they're building, this new Congo kingdom. So, so as a result, when I interacted with people who were BC Congo, they would say, oh, the prophecy's coming true. And at first I was really like, what is going on? I don't know what you're talking about. And finally, after it happened a number of times, I realized that they were understanding me through this prophecy that was being revived by Valdivia Congo at that moment. So people were understanding me through that kind of history. And so this is why it's so important for the body as center to be a part of anyone's research process. Because how is it that who you are impacting the interactions that you're having in your research? The next part of it is the body as conduit. And briefly, what I'm saying here is, how is it that the way that we use our bodies can affect our minds and feelings? So here I focus on how, for example, with Mobutu's government, they used this forced dancing and singing, where you were forced to sing the praises of Mobutu, to say he was the most powerful, to say he was all-knowing, all of these kinds of praises. And it wasn't just, it was everyone. It was everyone who would be forced to do this. So you had to salute the flag at a particular time. If you owned your own private business, you had to lead your workers in saluting the flag at a particular time. If you were in school as a teacher, you actually had to compose songs for your students to sing, and all honoring Mobutu and his name and his honor. So this was, and then in addition, if you were especially young women, you were in fact recruited into these what they called animation troops, l'animation. So you had to actually dance and sing for any visiting people from the government who would come to your area. And that also had other kinds of consequences in terms of expected sexual services as well. And so this is something that was an open secret. An open secret. And if you, I mean, many of you are familiar with the Rumble in the Jungle with Muhammad Ali. It took place in what was known at the time as Zaire. And if you look at any footage, you would actually see hundreds of people performing before that fight. And this is l'animation politique. So they would wear African printed cloth with pictures of Mobutu's face on it and sing these songs in his praises. And so this was a way that dance was being used to try and change people's minds. And it worked out, it was so interesting because when I interviewed people about this, even people who hated Mobutu, if one person started singing one of those songs from that era, they would just join in. Like, this was like an automatic reaction. And this is how powerful it was that these songs and dances were inculcated into them. And then the last part of it is the body as catalyst. Really understanding how bodies can be used, in fact, to change society. And again, I gave a number of examples of this, especially with the case of Valdivia Congo as well. So this is really looking at performances, again, not just as reflecting society, but also transforming it. Now, what are the larger kind of implications of this work? So while focusing on the BC Congo, gesture and power really has larger implications for humankind in general. It provides a theoretical framework for understanding how the micropolitics of the body and interpersonal encounters can affect macro-level social and political structures. So such a framework can even be applied to our own society, and I'll give you a more concrete example of this. So think about places like Nashville, places like other parts of the Deep South as well, where, for example, if you were African American, you were supposed to step off of a sidewalk if a white pedestrian was coming your way. So that was the status quo. What happened when the first person refused to move? What starts to happen to the social fabric and the status quo when someone refuses to comply with what is supposed to be the accepted behavior, right? And when that starts to spread. So these are the kinds of things that you can understand as performative encounters. And then the other thing I'll point out is looking at the body and giving more attention to the body will allow us to really understand the agency of the enslaved and other people of African descent in the Americas through their bodies as well. And this is something that's a whole new area that is a possibility to think about. So let me give you an example. If you can imagine yourself as a teenager. Some of you are closer than that than others to being teenagers. But you're sitting in front of the television watching TV, and your mother comes up to you and says, hey, get up and take the garbage out. And you look at your mother, and you roll your eyes and suck your teeth. Now, what might be the reaction of a parent who encounters that? Can anyone imagine how your parent might react to that? No, you can say what it might be.
That would be another bodily action, actually. My mother's eyes would go up and hand would go to the hip and say, who do you think you're talking to? Move the garbage.
There you go.
Always a physical reaction to something like that.
There you go. So how do you understand that particular eye roll and teeth sucking? What does that mean if someone does that to you? Even as a parent yourself, if your child was to do that to you. Disrespectful. It's disrespectful, right? It's a sign of disrespect. It's a sign of annoyance. But this is something that for many people who do this as a part of their own body vocabulary, you haven't thought about where that comes from. But in fact, it goes back to Africa. It has its origins in Africa. If you want to see the original teeth suck, go to Ghana, go to Nigeria, go to places where people can suck their teeth and it takes 2 minutes. And I'm not kidding. Like, it's like, and it just keeps on going. You know what I'm talking about, Moses? You know what I'm talking about. So there are ways in which the imprint of African ancestors and African people of African descent here in the U.S. have even spread, even outside of populations of African descent. But those are particular forms of embodiment that actually have their origins in the continent. And so this forms of embodied expression, if we pay attention to those things, what can we actually find? What can we actually see? What are the things that we're missing by not looking at that in regards to the population that was enslaved in the Americas? So very quickly, I just wanted to go over some of my research methods before I show you a few video clips. So basically, I use archival research, interviews, and also participant observation. In terms of archival research, I really wanted to understand what it was like during Mobutu's time, so I used interviews for that, but I also looked at some of the archival documents, and this was in the National Archives in Kinshasa. And then, in order to understand Simon Kimbangu's movement, I had to go to the original archives for the missionaries who were stationed there when it happened. So I went to, and also understand how the Belgians dealt with it as well. So I went to the African Archive in Belgium to look at some of the colonial documents that the Belgians had. I went to the archive of the Baptist Missionary Society, which is based at Oxford University, actually. So they were a British Baptist organization that it was on their mission, in fact, that Simon Kimbangu's movement started. He was actually, in fact, a member of their mission station. And then also the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, which is another Baptist organization that, in fact, came from the U.S. and established mission stations all along the lower Congo. And their archives are actually at Mercer University in Atlanta. So those were some of the archives that I had to touch on in order to really be able to contextualize Simon Kimbangu's movement in terms of how the missionaries were understanding it, in terms of how the Congolese themselves were understanding it, and how all of it was interacting and happening at that time. And I also did 62 interviews with musicians, dancers, church members, people who had participated in the Mangunza movement when it was happening, before independence, and a number of other people about these gestures, dances, and the spirit-induced trembling as well. And lastly, participant observation. So I attended a number of events, from weddings to the cleaning of tombs, to community theater performances, to rehearsals for performance groups, to a lot of church services in a number of different churches, in order to really understand, again, how embodiment was understood and being used in these different spaces as well. I just wanted to quickly show a few images to give you a sense of the research site. So Kinshasa is a huge huge city. At the time, it was 9 million people. I think it's more now. Attending a wedding, for example, in Kinshasa. In Luozi, it was a more rural community, working in the fields with a particular family, going to a funeral in Luozi. This was a community event. Everyone went when you had someone pass. Oftentimes, it was someone who passed outside of Luozi, and they brought the body back and brought them home to be buried. And one of the churches that I was very involved with, the Demana Church, which is one of the churches that emerged out of Simon Kimbangu's movement. Now, I wanted to now give you a sense, just 2 examples of performative encounters. And in order to do this, I'm going to come back to the book to read a page for you. So I wanted to give you an example of how people were using Zakama, the embodied trembling, during the time of Kimbangu. And so I'm just going to read a small section. About how much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay. I'll just read a small section from the book that is about a particular encounter between the territorial administrator for Luozi at the time, the Luozi territory, and a number of Bangunza who in fact were leading a meeting of other people. So the third performative encounter considered here involves a more violent interaction between Congo prophets in the colonial state. Léon Cartier had entered into Belgian colonial service in 1909, and by the summer of 1921, he had been territorial administrator for the Northern Cataract since 1920. As the prophetic movement spread throughout the Lower Congo, he left Luozi, the administrative center for the district, to conduct an investigation of prophets in the area between June 13th and 16th, 1921. So he reaches to one village called Dembo Village, and he asks the metal chief there, which was basically someone who had been appointed by the colonial administration to run over the village, to lead the village, and asked him what he heard about meetings of Bangunza. And again, Bangunza is the plural form for prophets. And Chief Libasa, the metal chief, responded, "They said, send us all your sick. We will heal them. The whites demand too much money from us for taxes. You don't have to pay." Those were the words of the Ngunza of Sheferi, of Chief Kao, village Kiesa, in the Southern Cataracts. So then now he's going from village to village, Sheferi is like a district, looking for these Bangunza that people are talking about. Finally, he comes to one of the places where they actually were located. Cartier, hot on the trail of the Bangunza, leaves Kimbanza at 5:30 in the morning, arriving at Yanga, where he questioned Chief Bemba, who then accompanied Cartier, so that they finally arrive at Mayombe village at 9 in the morning. There they saw a large crowd of people singing very loudly. After Chief Bemba pointed out that the 3 Bangunza were leading the crowd, Cartier tried to approach them. In spite of the songs and howls shouted by the entire crowd, I approached the 3 Ngunza and asked them to calm down. So the crowd yelled, saying, "We want nothing more but Jesus Christ. No more chiefs, no more obeying of the whites of the state, nothing." And so here you can see the reaction of the crowd is definitely openly saying they're protesting his presence there, but also the complicit nature of the chiefs who led him to them, and who were reporting them to the colonial administration and reporting their activities as well. And so after he tells them to quiet down and they refuse, that the crowd only refused to quiet down. They refused to quiet down, but also shouted that they no longer wanted to obey representatives of the colonial state, reveals that they were challenging the status quo in the Belgian colony. Cartier continued in his report. The chief of the Ngunza, named Timosi, saw that I was opposite him. He wanted to take the stick that he had within reach and tried to hit me. At the same time, I gave the order to my 12 soldiers who accompanied me to apprehend them. The soldiers obeyed immediately. The 3 Ngunza, but the name Timosi above all, mounted a very strong resistance, continuing while all the crowd shouted, "We do not want chiefs anymore. We don't want anyone but Jesus Christ." I gave everyone the order to stop the noise, and I achieved nothing. And he continues on, and basically the crowd continued to ignore his orders for calm and quiet. He has another situation where someone else actually grabs his arm, again, to try and hit him, and he ends up having to grab a gun of one of the soldiers that was with him and threatening to shoot it in order for people to quiet down. And he arrested the 3 Ngunza, had them tied up, and they had to be carried because they refused to walk, and they continued trying to sing and trying to get people to continue the singing at the same time. And so it was an interesting one to look at, because this was clearly an instance where the normal way of doing things in this colony was being turned on its ear. You could see colonial administrators and other agents of the state, for example, whipping Congolese, inflicting harm and punishment on Congolese bodies. There even was a type of whip that they used in particular called the chicote, which was made from hippopotamus hide that was dried out. And it was a preferred whip for beating people. So this kind of punishment inflicted on Congolese bodies was something that was a part of the colonial order. But in fact, you would not see the reverse. You would not necessarily see people raising their hands to colonial administrators at all at this point. And so these were, again, instances in which the authority was being directly challenged. And there are other examples of this where, for example, missionaries were trying to, came across a Mangunza an Ngunza who's trying to baptize someone, and trying to, it's really disrupting a number of different ways of doing things and trying to assert themselves in the everyday order in different kinds of ways. And so I wanted to give you an example of what this looked like. So this was one of the churches that I worked with while I was in the Congo. And what they basically did is they took the trembling that animated Simon Kimbangu's movement and continued, again, after Simon Kimbangu was arrested, as it continued on and other prophets popped up. And so the founder of this particular church, he himself had also been sent into exile to one of these labor colonies. And he actually was released in 1960 and came back and started a church. And so they've taken this embodied trembling and made it a part of their worship service. So it's not something to be rejected, but in fact something to be embraced. Sorry, it shouldn't be this bad. I'm going to try and restart it. But basically, this is, I'll just explain it really quickly. This is a part of the worship service called the bascule. And this is when the spirits are weighed. So basically, everyone's spirit is weighed. And based on how pure you are of spirit, you should be able to grab the hand of the person weighing the spirit, who's called the Entwining, and jump. And looking at how high you jump, that determines how pure you are of spirit. And so this actually, again, has other kinds of connections to other beliefs about the body. This jump, in fact, is called dumuna in Kikongo and also used to be used as a blessing. So it's a form of blessing at the same time that you also, your spirit is being weighed at the same time. So I hope it won't jump as much this time. But pointing out that the Entwining who's doing the weighing, he is supposed to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And he's in the center here, and if you've sinned, you shouldn't be able to grab his hand. It's jumping around a little too much, but so I'm sorry it's not smooth. I don't know why it's doing that. But I will point out that the music itself is actually supposed to be intentionally as loud as possible. This is supposed to help bring on the Holy Spirit. So the singing is supposed to be loud. The music is supposed to be loud. It's supposed to be deafening in order to allow this to happen. So I hope this second one works a little better. But this second performative, so I basically wanted to show you with that last piece what some of this embodied trembling looks like. And then the second piece is looking at Valdivia Congo. And as I mentioned, as a movement, they've taken this Bulamakonko gesture and used it to redefine as an emblem of their entire movement. And in fact, they've made it their prayer. So they do not pray with clasped hands like this. They pray like this, with the cup hand clapping. And so what I wanted to show you is a clip from a huge assembly they held in February of 2006, where in fact people came from all over the lower Congo and Kinshasa to Luozi, to this huge assembly, and just give you an example of what that prayer looks like. And I'll tell you what it means after. Why is it jumping like this? So this is actually the main prayer that Valdivia Congo uses, which in English is joy, joy, joy in the sky, joy here on land, a lot of joy and happiness in the name of the all-powerful Father God. We ask for forgiveness from the all-powerful Father. And what's interesting is this prayer is done a certain number of times in order to send your prayer up to Father Taten Zambi Mpungu. So the way that they articulated it to me is, again, this is a part of their religion, Bukongo, which is explicitly rejecting Christianity. So it's a Congo-centered religion in which Congo ancestors are at the center, as opposed to what they say is a white Jesus. So what they do is you actually pray, and as you're praying, if you'll notice, you're on your knees. You're supposed to pull up your pants. If you're a woman, you pull up your skirt. Your bare knees are supposed to be on the ground. The rockier the ground, the better for you to suffer while you're doing it. And you actually clap and also say the prayer a certain number of times. In the assembly, they actually cut it down. They did it 7 times, 4 times, and 7 times. In the Zikwa, which is a local, where Valdivia Congo has their worship meetings, they did the prayer 40, 72, then 40 times, and I actually sat and counted it based on the number of times I went to the Zikwa in Luozi. Now I'll say now that the Zikwa in Luozi has been burned down to the ground. In fact, again, because this movement became successful in terms of its political kind of representation, they became the target of the Congolese government. So when I went back in 2010, the Zikwa was gone. Valdivia Congo members were underground and were not trying to come out because they had, in fact, many of them had been killed. The government came in, the soldiers came in throughout Lower Congo, specifically attacking Zikwas of Valdivia Congo. This was in 2008, 7 and 8. But anyway, killed a number of people. And so you wouldn't even see. This is also why I black out people's faces, because literally you could be arrested for being a member of Valdivia Congo. But I wanted to make the point that they were using these embodied gestures to redefine a whole new kind of religion that is explicitly rejecting Christianity and trying to say that we need to have a religion that's based in our own experience. And again, this is a religion that they're, in a sense, creating, because when you look back at pre-colonial Congo religion, it looks very different than what they are doing right now in terms of how they're thinking about it in Valdivia Congo. But something about what they're saying, the sentiment that they're really trying to harness is this sense of marginalization that people have. And so now you have something that is centered on your culture and on your ancestors, and this is what attracts so many people to the movement, even if they're Christian. Even people who don't necessarily believe the religious part might still sympathize with the political goals. And I'll leave us with this last kind of point. This is an etching from if anyone recognizes this, this is an etching of Congo Square in New Orleans, right? And so this was a space that was known for the dances that people used to do. People from across, from many different backgrounds. Of course, also a lot of people coming from the Congo who were enslaved in Louisiana. And so I end with this image in order to get us to think about, again, what are those possibilities if we pay more attention to embodiment in our research and in the questions that we seek to pursue? What are the possibilities that are there if we really privilege the body as opposed to seeing it as a marginal part of our research? So in all, my hope is that seeing the body as center, as catalyst and conduit will open up some new possibilities of inquiry for scholars in various fields. And with this last image, I will say that there was a particular document that I'd come across about a missionary who was stationed in Brazil, who saw a woman who actually was enacting some of these gestures. And I'll just read this very, very quickly so you can just get a sense of it. In 1666, an Italian Capuchin missionary named Michael Angelo of Gatina traveled to Pernambuco, Brazil, on the first leg of an evangelizing mission to the Kingdom of Congo. Upon his arrival, he was struck by the curious behavior of one particular black woman whom he encountered. As soon as we landed in the port of Pernambuco, we saw a great crowd of people, as well blacks as whites, about us, and among them a black woman who kneeled, beat her breast, and clapped her hands upon the ground. I inquired what the good woman meant by all those motions with her hands, and a Portuguese answered me, "Father, the meaning of it is that she is of the Kingdom of Congo and was baptized by a Capuchin, and being informed that you were going thither to baptize, she rejoices and expresses her joy by those outward tokens." So again, if we privilege the body in the work that we're doing? What are the new avenues that open up to us in terms of our research? Whether dealing with the mainland in terms of the African continent or dealing with the diaspora that emerged from that motherland as well. Thank you so much for your time.
I saw in Suriname, it's 20 years ago now, I was in the interior of Suriname, among which had been closed off for 300 years. The Dutch, there was a war with the Dutch with slaves, and they signed an agreement, and they lived in the interior. And 2 Harvard professors went in. They were not ethnographers or social scientists, they were scientists, and found this community. And the anthropologist Richard Price and Sally Price have recorded this community. I went in there in the 79, I think it was, 78 or 79. And I went into the interior and realized that there was this kind of religious movement going on in the body, as I saw some of the dances and so on. It was banned in the city, in Paramaribo, which is the capital city. It was totally banned, except it continued. And so late one night, I mean really late, like 2 in the morning, we're driving through abandoned plantations trying to find the ceremony. And I heard it, and I got there, there was a group of women, and a man named Asa Hilliard was already there. Asa is dead now. He died about 8 or 9 years ago, but he's well known as a scholar. And I saw these exact same types of movement that you're describing. I shouldn't use the word exact, because I was looking at this and I immediately thought of Suriname. But there were lots of Congo slaves sold into Suriname and throughout that region. And so, to your question, your last question, I think this kind of research starts to link the diaspora to each other in terms of religious beliefs, physical action, and the cultural meaning of those actions. And I think you can find it in the United States as well, in terms of bodily action. It's not just from West Africa, but it's from Africa.
No, that's a very, very good point. It's a very good point. And I think that, you know, there's been attention to other kinds of things like linguistic kinds of connections, you know, and some religious kinds of connections as well. But Suriname is definitely an interesting case with a lot of evidence and in terms of these connections to Africa. And what I think, again, is if you do look at the embodied components of it, what will it tell us about what it means and how it's being used? And I think the thing that's compelling for me is that I truly believe that people see embodiment as a way of getting things done, as a form of action, as a way of acting upon the world. So then if that is the case, then what would they have done in these particular contexts where they're being oppressed in particular ways? What are the kinds of things that might have been happening to try and transform their worlds or control their worlds in particular ways? So I'll give you an example. I'm just starting to look at some of these connections on the other side. But when the Great Awakening was happening in the United States, the Great Awakening, and this rapid spread of Christianity, and especially Baptists also, in terms of coming into the South and being spread among the enslaved population and then post-slavery as well. One of the things I've been looking at is this jumping, that when people were talking about shouting and how they were filled with the Holy Spirit and shouting, and that there is this use of jumping that was very particular to the experience of how people were looking at the worship experiences of African Americans. That people actually complained about it, that, oh, they jump too much, they're messing up the furniture, they're doing this, they're doing that. But then when you look at the kind of historical and even contemporary, because it's not just Congo in the past, but or places like Congo in the past, but also Africa in the present, where people are still using these things in order to do things. these kinds of gestures. So this kind of jumping, which is known as dumana, this jumping that's a blessing, what happens if it's redefined in the context of the New World?
You know Sterling Stuckey's book?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Because he talks about the ring shout.
Yeah, the ring shout.
His book on slave culture.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that there's so many different avenues that could open up if we pay more attention to this. And again, unfortunately, you really literally have to make this the focus in order to really find some of this, right? Because too often, like the passage I read to you all about Brazil, I had read that before going to Congo, and it meant nothing to me. And it wasn't until I came back and read it again, I'm like, oh, that's Bula Makonko happening right there. But I had completely missed the meaning of it. I had read that same passage like 2 or 3 times, and I really thought nothing of it. But it wasn't until understanding what it could mean in the context there that I understood what she was trying to do in Brazil, and trying to connect to this missionary who specifically was going to Congo, and trying to connect with him through this form of embodiment. Yes.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I really like this idea of thinking about bodies as sort of performance vessels, and also that there's political power behind performance. We don't think about that stuff much in political science, but when I hear things like dance performance under Mobutu or singing national songs, I mean, I very much believe that. So what I'm thinking about is the role of autonomy of the body in this performance process, right? So for the very unfortunate history in somewhere like Congo, where during colonialism, removing the autonomy of bodies and even like living under dictatorship, sort of whether or not people have ownership of their own bodies, is the process of, do you think the process of performance and whether or not sort of I'm acting autonomously in my performance, if I'm sort of creating change and so on, is that a distinctive process that is claiming autonomy of my body versus what my body is doing? Sort of outwardly focused change, or they coterminous? Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. It's a very good question. And I don't think of them as being explicitly separated. I think that there are situations in which I think the thing that gets a little murky is even, for example, with the zakama, with the spirit-induced trembling. Who's actually causing this trembling? What is the role of spirituality in this? And how aware are people of what's happening? And depending on the person, people will tell you different things, right, in terms of their own awareness. There's not just one way to understand it. And so how much intentionality is there? Whose intentionality is that? Is it that of the Holy Spirit? Is it that of the person? How do you even get to figure it out? And so I don't want to see them as completely separated, because I think that because this is a process that's ongoing, I'll give you an example. So in Valdivia Congo, for example, at the same assembly that I went to in February, which was like over several days, there were a group of people who started doing karate. Now, people had told me about this before I went to the assembly. First of all, people warned me not to go because they said, all kinds of stuff could happen. There's violence that could happen, blah, blah, blah. But they had allowed me to go, invited me, said I could come, so I went. And they allowed me to film. And as I was filming, I started to notice, I actually write about this in the book, there was a woman who started doing machine gun sounds and doing karate gestures. And then she did a tuck and roll and like flipped and did all this stuff. And I turned my camera to her. And one of the leaders came up to me and said no, and told me to turn my camera the other way. And so they eventually started she wasn't the only one who was doing this. There were other people who were making these machine gun gestures, like they would make the sound of a machine gun. They would like jab and punch. And these were things that their own leadership were clearly not comfortable with and didn't want outsiders seeing it. And actually took them and started to move them to the back. And it became like a small group of people who were showing these different types of embodiment that did not support how they articulated, how Valdivia Congo leaders were articulating Bukongo as a religion, or what was accepted in terms of embodied expression, right? And so, but what would happen if one of these people stood up and gave a prophecy? What would happen? Those are the possibilities, and you can see why they were trying to control it. Because then, if you have this belief in continuous prophecy, what if someone who's supposed to be under the influence of some spirit decides to give a prophecy that in fact says something against a leader, or does something that really derails the goals of Valdivia Congo? So they were trying to control it. And so in this instance then, who is actually intentional in that regard. So I guess I'm using that to answer you to say that I don't necessarily see it as needing to be entirely autonomous or not, that you can still accomplish things or things get done regardless of who has the intention, is how I would respond to that. And even with Mobutu's movement, so even though people themselves were automatically singing these songs or remembering the dances, even though they may not have agreed with him, there were ways that they got out of it. So I interviewed some women who were part of these troops, and the way that they were able to leave was to get married, because they focused on single women for a purpose, so that they could send them and use them for sex. So basically, you'd be lined up dancing, and then whoever was the official visiting would say who he wanted, and that's who they sent to him later on. So the way to get out of it, the women that I interviewed, they all got married. So there are ways that, the resistance can, your form of resistance to it, and even the ways of dealing with it can have different kinds of shades. And then for some people, they benefit from it. There was a woman who was the head of like the local animation troops for all of Lower Congo. She loved Mobutu. She now has like a government job. So she's happy, But for the other women who were forced to dance and didn't end up with those positions or those benefits, they had a whole different story to tell. Does that kind of...
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question, a couple of questions actually.
Yeah.
This last comment you made leads me to my question, which is the role of gender in all of this. Which most national cultural movements tend to be very masculine. Tend to be very, especially in the African context, tend to be very. If you look at even the revolutionary movement, the anti-colonial revolutionary movements, they tended to be very masculine and tended to, be very patriarchal. I'm wondering whether, that's a feature of this movement as well.
Of Valdivia Congo?
Yeah, what was the role of women, particularly how visible were there, how much of, their voice
was there.
came out. And then the second question I had was with regards to pre-colonial Christianity, Catholicism in Congo, the Kingdom of the Congo. How did that intrude into this new movement that is trying to recreate, basically the pre-colonial Congo Kingdom, or some aspect of it as some symbol, to use it as a symbol, right?
Yes.
Does that intrude or disturb this? Because they're trying to run away from Christianity, right?
Yes. No, it's
a new religion. That's their claim.
Yeah.
But
I mean, they say it's an old religion.
They say what?
They say it's an old religion that they have. The Congo is. But when I got into debates with them about it, I'll tell you how they responded to that. When I said, well, the Congo Kingdom converted to Christianity in 1491. Before Christopher Columbus even left to come to the Americas. So why is it that this new religion doesn't even include anything? And then they said, well, you're reading the wrong books. It's not the right. You're reading the white man's history. That's why you don't know that this is our religion that has existed since then. So they basically, their discourse then becomes, what are your sources for your information? Why are you believing these sources that were written by people who are non-Congolese, who are not Congo people themselves? Which is interesting, because then when they needed something to support some of their other claims, then they would use the same sources. But anyway, so we had some interesting debates around that. Because I respectfully disagreed and tried to probe where they were getting their information, but it basically was just shifted based on what they needed it to say. But it was a challenge. They said, why are you using these sources that were written by white people, by outsiders? Use our book. Use our own sources to understand Congo culture.
Were there Catholic iconographies that have been domesticated that you could identify as an expert?
It's interesting. This part of knowing this long history of Christianity, right, since 1491. In fact, more of the kind of, I guess, more recent influence in terms of Christianity, it really came in the late 1800s with the Protestant missionaries in this area, but not necessarily the Catholics. So although the Catholics were there since 1491, they were very sparse. There were only a few missionaries who were sent out, and they were supposed to evangelize to these huge parts of the Congo Kingdom, and also Angola, other parts of Angola, other parts. So they had a huge task, and so it was often just a few of them at any one time. So there definitely was a form of Christianity that developed, but it was in some ways different than what some of the European forms of Christianity were looking like. So like baptism, they would use salt instead of water. they would place a piece of salt on your tongue in order to baptize you. And this was during the Catholic Christianity that was developing in the 1500s, 1600s. And so, but I think the more powerful influences in terms of Christianity happened with the Protestant missionaries who went in with Belgian colonization. Because the whole area was opened up. And in fact, it was first the Protestants who went in before the Catholics, in fact. Because once the Catholic mission that had been there kind of fluctuated and really there was no one really left. It wasn't really active as much. But the Protestants that went in later, in the 1800s especially, ended up establishing a number of mission stations along the lower Congo, along the Congo River and around it, because this was kind of the entry point to the rest of Congo. So they put a lot of their resources into that. So from the British to the Americans to others who went there, it's really interesting because the lower Congo has a huge Protestant influence, whereas the rest of the country is mostly Catholic. So although there's a Catholic church as well, and other Catholic churches, they came later. They came later in terms of the colonial era. And in terms of the gender, yes, Valdivia Congo is very male. And man, when I attended their meetings in the Zikwa, I was just like, wow, there's a lot of testosterone up in here. You know, it's really like, it's like that. And a lot of the women who were involved were like the wives or the daughters or the sisters of the men who were the leaders or members of the movement, which made it look very different than some of the other spaces, some of the other churches where you saw more women. Like you see oftentimes here in some African American churches where women are the majority of the congregation. In many of the other churches, like even the Demona church is majority women, although all the leadership roles are men, right? So there's some other kinds of ways that these gender hierarchies are maintained.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.